they're seeking advice from, because it's complicated stuff. And I tell them what I will tell you right now, and that is if the choice is between, on the one hand, a lousy bill, and I think it is a lousy bill, and on the other hand, economic Armageddon, and I think there would be a major freezing of credit markets if this thing doesn't go through. Credit markets are already freezing up. I would vote for a lousy bill. But that doesn't solve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that even if credit markets unfreeze, and I certainly hope this bill helps unfreeze them, we're still in, as the current president's father once said, deep doo-doo economically. And we're in trouble economically, and we're heading into a recession economically, not so much because credit markets are frozen, but primarily because most people have no more money to spend. Median wages, adjusted for inflation, have been dropping. Median incomes, household incomes have been dropping. Most people are pulling in their belts, not because they cannot get credit, but because they're already so deeply in debt, they can't possibly pay the interest on the credit. Well, how did we get into this fix? And what are the political implications? And how does all of this have to do with the election? How much time do we have, by the way? I forgot to ask. Anybody in charge here?
All night, if you're up there.
Okay, I'll try to. I will really keep this to 4 hours. I don't. No, I'll keep this to about. What I want is your questions, so I'll try to keep this to about 20 minutes. Okay? No? More? You want more? You don't even know what I'm going to say, and you want more? This is pretty depressing stuff. I don't think you can take 20 minutes of it. No, look at this. This all happened. This really started off in the 1970s and early 1980s. That's when the germ of the problem started. And the germ of the problem was that if you are in a routine production job, and most Americans simply don't have enough education to do more than a routine production job. And by routine production job, I mean whether you are in the service industry or you're in manufacturing, you're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. If you are in a routine production job, where most Americans were in the 1970s, you discovered that that job could be done more cheaply either by software or by someone in another country for a lower wage. By software or over there. Software over there. And that meant that beginning in the 70s, hourly wages for men in the United States started to drop, adjusted for inflation. Now, what did families do? They used 3 coping mechanisms to try to keep on spending. Coping mechanism number 1 was sending women into the paid workforce. Now, I would love to believe, as many of you perhaps have experienced, that women streamed into the workforce in the 1970s because of all of the wonderful opportunities open to professional women. Well, that is true in part. There were many new opportunities open to professional women starting in the 1970s, but that's not the reason most women went into the US workforce. Most women went to the workforce because they had to in order to prop up family incomes that were dropping because male wages were not keeping up. And we got to the 1980s and early 1990s, and about 70% of all of the women in the workforce had young children. There's not too much more you can do. That is, you reach an end of that coping mechanism at some point. Which means we had to turn to coping mechanism number 2, which we actually started to turn to in the 1980s, and we accelerated in the 1990s and right in this particular decade, and that is working more hours. The typical American worker now works 350 more hours a year than the typical European worker. We never worked this hard. Go back in history. the extent that we have records. We are working even harder than the typical Japanese worker now. And if you consider 2 wage earners in a family, and also ask yourself, well, who's going to take care of the kids, and who is going to do all the housework and everything else? And those 2 wage earners are both at work and working more hours. Well, you can understand some of the strains. I call those families DINS, D-I-N-S. Double income, no sex. You wonder why the birth rate is going down in the United States. Well, then we come to coping mechanism number 3, because there are only a certain number of hours you can possibly put in. Coping mechanism number 3 was for families to go deeper and deeper into debt. And that started in the 1980s. It increased in the 1990s. We are now seeing record levels of debt. But you see, the debt issue was masked by the housing bubble, because it became easy as housing prices went up, particularly this decade, for people to use their houses as piggy banks and get money out of their houses through refinancing or through home equity loans. And that kept families going. That maintained coping mechanism number 3 until the housing bubble burst and housing values dropped. And now, the great American middle class is, for all intents and purposes, broke. And so, if we are being honest with ourselves about the problems of the economy, we've got to look to what has happened to the purchasing power of a huge portion of the American public. Because without that purchasing power, how are you possibly going to absorb all the goods and services that are being produced in the United States? Exports can't possibly handle them. We rely on a big indigenous market, or at least we have. And here comes the interesting point. Because many people, when they talk about inequality, they assume that inequality is just about justice, social justice, and it's something that fuzzy-headed liberals from the East and West Coasts worry about, and that there's some trade-off between social justice and equality on the one hand, and economic growth on the other hand. That's the way we used to teach it. That's the way I certainly used to be taught, and the way I learned and the way I understood it for many years. But look at it the way I am now suggesting. Right now, the top richest 1% takes home roughly 20% of national income every year. Now, to put that into perspective, in 1980, the top 1% took home 8% of national income. You can see how much concentration there is at the top. The problem is that the wealthy do not spend the same proportion of their incomes as people in the middle or below them, because they are wealthy. Being wealthy means you are not going to spend very much because you almost have pretty much what you need. That's what it means to be rich. And hence, if there is not enough purchasing power in the majority of the population, you are going to hit the wall. They're going to go deep into debt. That debt is going to collapse at some point, and your purchasing power is going to be inadequate for the purpose of absorbing the goods and services the economy produces. Now, this is not rocket science. In fact, it is historically the case, because the last time in the United States the top 1% took home 20% of the national income was the year 1928. I told you I would cheer you up. Something happened in the year 1929, but the more important thing is that people who look back on the 1920s, a decade of enormous growth and kind of anything goes on Wall Street and all sorts of debt, huge amounts of debt, housing debt, mortgage debt. You see that collapsed, and there was inadequate aggregate demand to keep the economy